Look all around you and you'll see things that you take for granted. You think that they've always been there, but they weren't. In fact, it was a thousand and thousands of years ago that events occurred that is responsible for you being right here, right now. What was it? We're going to learn all about that today on this week's version of the State of Greater Western New York Report, which as always is brought to you by...
Each week, our community makes history. Each week, you make history. And each week, there's only one source to turn to for the first take on history. You know what that is? Subscribe to the Sentinel right now to discover the history being made in your own backyard. The Mendon Honeoye Falls Lima Sentinel. More than just your news, it's your history. Welcome, everyone, to this edition of the State of Greater Western New York Report. Join us each episode as we discuss fantastic topics ranging from history to science to the strange and the wonderful, as well as the treasured spirit with which our region has infused America. We challenge you to consider all things Greater Western New York, from our region's very beginnings to how it inspires, how it empowers, and why it is so admired. Here's the host of the State of Greater Western New York Report, Chris Carosa.
Hi there, and welcome everyone again to this week's episode of the State of Greater Western New York Report. Hey, you know what? It's right on your feet. You just don't know about it. You just don't see it. It's all over the place. We're going to be revisiting something that we left off about a year ago, which is really sort of, you could think of, part two of the geological history of the Greater Western New York region. Now, when we left off, we were speaking with George McIntosh, who is a retired geologist from the Rochester Museum and Science Center, and he told us about this picture that you see behind me, which is really a picture of what the geological formations look like in the area of New York. And you see those lines, they represent different rock strata. And if you notice, there was something going on right at the northern edge of the Western New York region. And I'll replay for you what George McIntosh said about that area, which was really emblematic of the Devonian age. We see a lot of Devonian era rocks from this place.
Well, that's an interesting point, because an awful lot of this is later covered by sediments dropped by the glaciers, the giant continental glaciers that came in here starting about 2 million years ago or so. But there are some good exposures, people from all over the world. I mean, when I say all over the world, I mean China and Australia and Europe. And certainly people from North America come to Western New York to study our fossils and our rocks. There's good exposures, obviously, down at Letchworth. And there's good exposures in a variety of different places.
Today, we've got with us Richard Young, who's a professor emeritus at SUNY Geneseo. He's an expert on glaciers, and he's going to tell us a little bit about what really is responsible for what we've seen in that era of the woods right where we are. And in fact, if you want to look at it a little bit more closely, we'll see that we have these rocks that are really kind of all over the place in terms of what we have, all this different stream of rocks here. And if you take a closer look, this is really going to be the responsibility of the glaciers for causing this exposure that we see. We're going to see this pattern here. Notice how those rocks, where we had that different strata of rocks, it's flatland. And here's a picture of the rocks again. And let's go to the topographical map. You'll see that there's no real jagged fissures here, or the southern tier has all these craggy things over here, and it's relatively smooth in the northern tier of the Greater Western New York region. So let's bring on Richard Young, who's going to tell us a little bit more about why we're seeing what we're seeing, and let's begin it right now.
All right, well, in this part of New York State, those rocks that were discussed earlier in the Devonian, everything above the Devonian period has been eroded from this part of the world by early rivers, but more recently by the glaciers during what we call the Pleistocene period or the Pleistocene era. And that's divided into many sub-partitions when the ice advanced across this region probably at least 10 times in roughly every 100,000 years. But the Pleistocene, as it's defined today, is approximately 2.6 million years old. And the last ice advance during the Pleistocene is called the Wisconsin, and the Wisconsin is divided into three parts: the early Wisconsin, the middle Wisconsin, and the late Wisconsin. And what you see around you in the landscape was all formed pretty much during the late Wisconsin. And that was when the ice advanced all the way down to Long Island, approximately 25 to 30,000 years ago.
So behind me, again, you see that picture of what the topographical area looks like in really all of New York State. But we're going to focus on the greater Western New York region. And as Professor Young said, much of what we see today is really the result of retreating glaciers that happened, say, roughly, the retreat probably ended around 12 or 13,000 years ago. So let's take a look at some of these maps here of what was actually going on when these glaciers retreated. We're going to start with the very early on. You can see the glaciers really were coming down. This is as they were beginning their retreat. They covered pretty much the entire Great Lakes area. But you'll see a lake down where Lake Erie, really south of Lake Erie, in northern Ohio. That's a new lake. That's not a new lake. That was one of the original lakes that were created as the glaciers were retreating. And if we move time forward, we're going to see how the glaciers go back. But before I do that, I want you to notice, see these blue areas? That's where the glaciers were draining. So they're eventually draining down what's going to become the Mississippi River Valley. But you can see all those glaciers are really going down to the Gulf of Mexico. The water from those glaciers is going down to the Gulf of Mexico. As we retreat, the water starts taking a different course. Look at what's going on in New York State. This water is actually retreating now through central New York, the Susquehanna River, and you're seeing the beginning developments of the Finger Lakes, those little fingers of waters that is coming out of those channels that were dug as the glaciers were coming down from the north. In addition, you see the early formation of Lake Erie, which is actually called Lake Whittlesey at this point. And there's also a Lake Saginaw and a Lake Chicago that are really pre-Great Lakes. These are before the Great Lakes. So the water's draining from the glaciers, creating these lakes that don't exist anymore, and going down through these channels, now the Susquehanna River, as well as continuing down through the Mississippi Valley, or what would become the Mississippi River. Advancing further, now you see what happens, that the ice is both retreating and advancing depending on what region of the country you're looking at. But over here in the Western New York region, it is clearly retreating, and we see a larger portion of Western New York exposed, and this Lake Erie, now a new lake, Lake Huron, is really starting to form, getting a little bit larger, as is Lake Chicago by that Finger Glacier that's going backwards. All that water is going down there. Now, what happened with our drainage? The drainage changed again. This time, we left the Susquehanna drainage, and we're going down again eventually to the Mississippi River, although there's a lot of blockage here, which might account for some of the water that's sticking around. As we move forward in time, we'll see another lake forming where Lake Superior is now, the Glacial Lake Duluth, and this Glacial Lake Chicago is also getting bigger, forming a lot of what will end up becoming Lake Michigan. Lake Lundy, or Dana or Elkton, depending on what you want to call it, is really where Lake Erie is at this point. And what's going on with Lake Ontario? Well, it's not there yet. We still don't have Lake Ontario. But here's the other interesting thing. Notice where the water is draining from the Western New York region, from that glacier that's over Lake Ontario. It is going down the Mohawk River, through the Hudson, and then into the Atlantic Ocean. There was no river, no St. Lawrence River at this point. Everything was going down through the Mohawk and Hudson valleys. As we move further along, we see that something's happening in this area of Western New York. And let's focus in just on this area, blow up the picture a little bit. And here we have the ice really coming down and forming a ridge. We'll learn more about this in a minute from Professor Young. Those are going to be called moraines, those east-west kind of lines that represent the extent of the ice's retreat. The ice is dumping dirt and everything down in that area. That's where you get these ridges. So this is kind of like the major extent of the ice in our region. Now it goes a little bit further south, but notice this is where the thickest part of the ice is. This is also the flat area that you saw in the map before, and that I'll show you again in a moment what it looks like. Everything south of this has not been dug out by the glaciers. That's why you still have these very prominent ridges and angled patterns. You don't have the smooth valleys that you see, say, like going down to Dansville, that valley that was dug out, or even to some extent the Genesee River valley, how it's been smoothed out by the glacier. So as the glacier retreats, you're going to see a change in the way the water is flowing. Right now, again, right on the edge of the picture, you see it going out through the Mohawk River. As we go back further, the ice is retreating, still going out through the Mohawk River, still populating the Great Lakes, although there are much larger lakes than they are now. As we go back, notice what Lake Ontario is. It's actually not called Lake Ontario at this point. It's called Lake Iroquois. And look at the shoreline of Lake Iroquois. That represents another ridge that we saw left by the glacier. And as we eventually go back further, you'll see the shoreline recede to the current shoreline of Lake Ontario. But notice still the St. Lawrence Valley is blocked and the water has to escape via the Mohawk River. Here's that picture again in a much larger scale. You see how the water is going through the Mohawk River, still on the western end, is still going down through the Mississippi River Valley. But that glacier, as it recedes, you're going to start to see this Lake Iroquois again that is much larger than Lake Ontario. Lake Erie is actually a little bit about the same size that it is right now. Water is still flowing through the Mohawk River. The St. Lawrence Seaway, what is today the St. Lawrence Seaway, is really a low-level sea. It's called a Champlain Sea, and it's coming into what is now Lake Ontario, the basin, but you don't really see the extent of this on the map. So the glacier is receding. As it goes further away, you start to see the water now going up through the St. Lawrence River. Remember, the glacier also pressed the earth down. So as it was receding, as it left the land, that land actually started to raise. So it helped push the water going north the way we see it now. So this is kind of where we're at with the glaciers and the recession. Now, what we're going to do when we come back is we're going to actually start talking about some specific formations in and around the Western New York area. In fact, one of them is quite well known, and it has been recorded in time. It is actually one of the first areas that was recorded in the history once the Europeans came over in writing a description of this event. So we're going to come back to this in a moment, but right now let's take a break, and we'll be right back after this message.
Through the mists of time, nature and man have both created and buried treasures beyond the imagination. With the ages, these riches slowly dissolve into mere myths until they are forever forgotten. But there are those brave souls who tirelessly cling to the truth, ever seeking to discover the undiscovered, to reveal what has always been there, to uncover the hidden gems of a land thought forsaken but loved by millions. 50 Hidden Gems of Greater Western New York. Discover the secrets in your own backyard. Buy your copy now at 50hiddengems.com.
Welcome back to the State of Greater Western New York Report. We're learning about glaciers today and how they formed the land upon which we live. I'm going to go back to this picture behind me again, which now that you saw how the glaciers retreated, let's zoom in on this picture and really notice that plain. What did that plain look like? Remember what I said, the thickest part of the glacier didn't go all the way down into the southern tier. It stopped a little bit less than halfway through the western New York region, and it flattened the land, it carved out the land, it made it smooth, and you can see where it didn't hit in the southern tier, how it's still pretty ragged. I want you to notice a couple other things that we'll get to before the end of the show. Notice how there's some relief ridges. You can almost detect the outline of the original Lake Iroquois. Remember, it's a little bit bigger than Lake Ontario is right now. And you notice that the shoreline forms almost like a ridge just south of the shoreline of Lake Ontario. In addition, there's another ridge that sort of was at the end where the land starts getting rough again, where it stops being smooth. That's another ridge that we'll get to in a moment. But right now, I want to bring on our guest again, who's going to tell us a little bit about some of the things that we've seen in and around the greater Western New York region, which is really, it really has to do with some local features that you could actually go see and discover for yourself. So Richard Young, again, is emeritus professor at SUNY Geneseo. He's a glacier expert, and I asked him to describe some of the formations that's all around us, and in one area in particular, that are left over from when the glaciers came. So Professor Young, why don't you tell us a little bit more about that?
After the ice advanced to Long Island, it actually created Long Island and Block Island and Cape Cod. They wouldn't be there if they hadn't formed by the debris being washed off the glacier. Then it retreated back to New York State, and approximately 12,900 years ago, it was in Dansville. And then it slowly retreated northward across the state for about 4,000 years. And in the process, it created a series of ridges that run east-west. And those ridges are places where the ice temporarily was still, it was melting at the same rate that it was advancing. So it dropped a lot of sand and gravel. And there are roughly a dozen moraines between Pennsylvania and Lake Ontario. One of them runs through the University of Rochester, and that's called the Pinnacle Hills, where all those radio towers are. But one of the more interesting features that formed along with the moraines, we have a whole series of other irregular landforms. We have small ponds, which are where ice blocks melted, and we have piles of sand and gravel called kames, K-A-M-E-S, and kames are simply places where piles of sand and gravel were dumped more than elsewhere, so they stand above the local landscape. But the moraines are these long ridges, and a fairly complex sequence of moraines and kames and kettles formed at the location known as Menden Ponds. Sometimes there were tunnels under the ice and in those tunnels the streams deposited more sand and gravel. So we get these long ridges that instead of running east-west like the moraines, they run north-south pretty much. And some of them have bends in them, just like a meandering river. So when you go to Menden Ponds Park, you see the cames and kettles and the small ponds and hills. And then you see the long ridges, which are the eskers, as they're called, formed underneath the ice as it was melting.
Oh, so we see the eskers here on the pictures on the screen, but there's a little bit more than was going on than just this. In fact, if you the Menden Ponds area is something that you can go see, and it's really interesting. You know, once you get there, you could actually see these moraines. Let's go back to that one picture of the cames in Menden Ponds Park here, just to give you a sense for how things have changed over time. It was this picture, I think, is from the early 1900s. It comes from the Menden Historical Society, and you can see the cames here. You're sort of looking towards Rochester. You don't see it obviously in the background, but these rolling hills are the cames, and there are some ponds in the back there. The interesting thing about Menden Ponds Park is when the French came and attacked the Seneca villages in the 1600s, as they went back to their landing spot on Ontario Bay, they passed through Menden Ponds Park. They camped there overnight, and they actually described the ponds in the writing that you see. So Menden Ponds Park has a long history dating back really before much was colonized here in the Western New York region. There's another aspect to the glaciers that I think you might find interesting that Professor Young is going to talk to us about, and that involves, remember how I said the water was going in different places in different directions as the glaciers advanced and retreated? Well, this multiple glaciation, this back and forth of the glaciers coming in, actually changed a prominent geological feature that really splits the greater Western New York region. So, Professor Young, why don't you tell us a little bit about that and maybe what it means?
The Genesee Valley is formed mostly by the Genesee River, but not only by the modern Genesee River. There was a series of rivers over the last 2 million years, and each time there was a glacier advancing from the north, that would be followed by a reformation of the river after the ice melted. So the present course of the river is very complicated. There are old valleys like the one at Dansville and the one through Nunde from the south end of Letchworth Park from Portageville to Nunde. And the newest part of the river system is Letchworth Park, and that's clear because it's formed in bedrock. And the signature for young valleys in this part of the world is those that are formed in bedrock are the ones that formed after the last ice melted. So the river formed a new course that it hadn't occupied before entirely, and that's the one through Letchworth. Then it continued on past Geneseo and up through to the area of Rochester. Now, there's also an older channel that is often discussed in the literature, and that's where the river turned to the east in the area of Rush and then flowed north into what is today Irondequoit Bay. But that probably happened more than once, and each time the ice advanced, it made the valleys a little bit bigger or shaped them and carved them a little bit deeper so that some of them are actually below sea level today. At least the bedrock of the valley is below sea level. So the Genesee River, since the last ice age, roughly 13,000 years ago, the Genesee River has never flowed through Irondequoit Bay since then, although it did in the long ago distant past and maybe more than once. But the present day channel is the one that formed as the ice retreated northward and the river ended up flowing through Rochester.
Thank you, Professor Young. Now let's go back to our topographical map here that we see in the background. And let's look at a couple of other things. And not only did the course of mighty rivers change, but we had some other geographical features that I alluded to before that actually led to you. How did that happen? Well, let's look at this map and we'll see again how this topographical feature looks. So you see there's the shoreline of the original Lake Iroquois, which is just below the shoreline that we see for today for Lake Ontario. In addition, there's another ridge, or what ended up being a series of moraines, just south of that, that almost goes at the top of the Finger Lakes to Buffalo. That was the high ground that people used eventually. There's the key thing. Here's a closer look of what we see on these ridges, and you can see how these ridges look. They're very prominent in terms of being east-west in direction. And it turns out that this is the path that early animals took. I don't know why we're doing that. Early animals took as they went to the receding glaciers to eat food and things like that. And as you see here we go, my graphics are a little odd. I've drawn these two dotted lines. The red line is the upper ridge, and that is today Ridge Road. So that original path left by the glacier actually became Ridge Road today, a major east-west thoroughfare. And by now you probably can guess what the blue dotted line is. That's 5 and 20. Now, of course, it isn't as straight. Neither one of these are as straight as the lines indicate, and you can see by the terrain that there are some curves here on what you want. But this was a major path. The Iroquois used this path. Both of these paths, the Iroquois actually had a third one down through the southern tier that was called the Hidden Trail. But the Great Genesee Turnpike, which ended up being 5 and 20, was the blue line here, and that's where a lot of settlers came from the New England area. So when Western New York was settled, this was the route that they took. And if you look at the Great Lakes, the Finger Lakes there, where Geneva and Canandaigua are, you could see why those cities really grew initially in prominence. It wasn't until later that cities like Rochester and Buffalo really exploded, and that in part was due to the Erie Canal, which was yet another sort of pathway that we had going through the Western New York region. So with that, I want to thank everybody for participating and being in part of today's show. I want to thank Professor Young for giving us his expert opinion on what it was like to be a glacier and come through the greater Western New York area. We didn't really have time for a lot of questions. I sort of answered them without asking or repeating what they were. But I want to thank our listeners here. And if you want to be a listener, you're invited to sign up for free at our site, stateof.greaterwesternnewyork.com. And each Thursday, you will get an invitation to participate in the show, or at least watch the show. You can ask questions of our guests if you'd like. If not, that's fine too. But just feel free to sign up. It's free, and you'll get this private invitation every Thursday morning so you can attend through Zoom. And with that, if you can't attend the live event, the show is archived on our website, so you can always get these shows. In addition, it's rebroadcast every Sunday at 1:30. So you could watch it on our Facebook page. Be sure to like that, and you'll be notified when it's airing. Or our YouTube channel, subscribe to that, and again, you'll be notified when it's airing. So now I think that I can say thank you all for being a part of today's show, and we hope to see you again next week when we'll talk more about the state of Greater Western New York. Bye-bye for now.